Our story began in 1974, when news of a tragedy reached Norwegian lock engineer Tor Sarnes. His favorite American singer, Connie Francis, had been attacked by an intruder in her hotel room. Tor couldn't believe that this had happened. He resolved there and then to invent a door-opening system that would provide a unique key for every hotel guest. His invention was VinCard, and it changed the whole lock industry. For decades to come, hotel guests all over the world could finally feel safe and secure when they arrived at their destinations. VinCard L-Safe has been an industry pioneer and world-leading brand for 40 years.
We couldn't think of any way to make it more dramatic. So this impacts about 166 countries, 42,000 facilities, and millions of door locks worldwide. Or, if you're more a visual type, it reflects to these type of brands. So we don't really know exactly which hotel chains and facilities are affected or impacted, but these are the references that ASSA ABLOY gives publicly. Or if you're even a more visual type, it translates to these type of places globally around the world. Also, these type of things, like luxury yachts and marine cruisers. We are the Penn and Teller of InfoSec, with one notable exception. We are not rich, or famous, or funny, and the shorter guy actually talks, right, Timo? So, moving on. So, we come from this small distant country called Finland. We both work for F-Secure, and that's pretty much the only thing that we're going to say about that. So, the story goes back to 2003, when we were attending an invite-only hacker conference in German Berlin called pH Neutral. And once we got back to our hotel room, our colleagues or friend's laptop had been stolen from his locked hotel room. And we reported that incident to the hotel management, but they didn't really take us seriously. And I can't really think of any reason why, because we were fine, distinguished bunch of gentlemen there. But they told us that there was nothing suspicious going on and everything looked exactly as it should. So that got us thinking, how is it possible that our friend's laptop had been stolen from his hotel room, locked hotel room, if I may add. So we decided to go where no gender neutral has ever gone before. Went to our favorite search engine and started looking for clues if there has been any prior art to this system called VinCard. And there were absolutely zero hits. So challenge accepted, and we decided to take a look. And if you look at these type of things, there are a few ways how you can approach them. So we built our own attack tree. The first one being physical lock. So obviously you can take a look at the physical lock and see if you can bump key it or do some other techniques which allows you to bypass the physical lock itself. Then you have an option of going after the electronic lock itself. So you can reprogram the lock, you can do stuff with the firmware, or maybe you can bypass it with 4 super magnets. Then you have access tokens, in this case, ULTRALIGHT cards. And then, of course, you have the backend system which controls everything. Most people seem to think that if you're using a fine hotel like this, all the doors are connected to the back-end system. That's not the case. All the doors are kind of standalone. So they usually consist of a battery, a small real-time clock, and a small chip that contains the actual logic. So there is no centralized repository for logs or anything like that. We'll get back to that later on. So first, if you have something like this, you need to understand the target. The only thing we had was this card. And it doesn't really tell you that much, except that back in the day, it used to be a small Norwegian company that came up with the idea that, yeah, you need to have a unique key for every lock. Thanks, Sherlock. And this is what we had back then. Well, we started our hacking spree by going after the FTP servers. This is how hacking looked like back in the day. So you scan for anonymous FTP servers and you download all the goods because people don't really know how FTP works. And once you have, this is the piece of software that is used to program the logs, and this is the demo database, and then you have your manuals and so on. Then we looked at the patents. Most people nowadays think that patents are kind of useless, but at this time, patents were a trove of information. So you could find all sorts of diagrams explaining how these locks work, also mechanically, but also the electronics. So you would have information, like what kind of information would be stored on those actual tracks, and what kind of data would be stored on the card, possibly. It also contains interesting pieces of information. So how many of you knew that if you have a Magstrack card, it's actually, most of the time, it's red when you take it out, not when you put it in, because it's five times more reliable to read it when you take it out. So many of our peers who tried to analyze this had been reading the bit stream in the wrong direction. So, physical locks.
The first thing that we tried was bypassing the physical lock without leaving any visible marks. And obviously, if you want to do that, you need to get your hands on a physical lock. So that's exactly what we did. We ordered one on eBay. Then we started analyzing the lock, trying all sorts of different tricks. For example, we tried using strong magnets to open the lock. We also tried hitting the lock with a rubber hammer to open it. Now remember that the goal was to open the lock without leaving any visible marks. Maybe not that surprisingly, we failed. Assa Abloy has been creating these locks for decades, and the mechanical locks are of very high quality. So no success doing this. Later, we learned from our Dutch friends that if you have about 10 seconds and $1, you can do this. The way you do it is that you have a piece of thick metal wire or a coat hanger, you slide it under the door, then you twist it upwards, and you use that coat hanger to pull the handle from the inside of the hotel room. In a minute, we're going to see the same trick from the inside of the hotel room. So you slide the coat hanger under the door, then you turn it up like that, and you pull the handle. That's what it takes to bypass the mechanical lock. Now, if you want to protect yourselves against this, what you can do is that you can put a towel between the door and the handle, and that will prevent this attack. We needed a better plan. Bypassing the mechanical lock didn't work. So we started focusing on bypassing the electronic lock. And the approach that we took here was to try to reprogram the lock. Like Tomi already mentioned, we had found the LockLink software on an FTP site, and that's the piece of software that you use to reprogram the locks. In order to run the software, you need one of these compact iPad handheld computers. Those were quite popular at the time, not that popular anymore. So we got one of those, and we got the software running. We did some analysis on the software, and we realized that all the interesting stuff actually doesn't happen in the software. It happens in a component called a contact card. So that's the number 5 that you see in that photo. So what you do is you connect that contact card to the compact handheld computer, and the other end of the device, the large end that you see on the photo, you slide that to the lock, just like you do with a key card. You slide it there, and then you can program the lock. And it's that piece of hardware that implements all the interesting stuff that's needed for reprogramming the lock. The unfortunate thing was that we couldn't get our hands on one of these contact cards. You couldn't buy it on eBay or anything. So again, yet another dead end. We couldn't get anything out of this research track. However, I would say that we were on the right track, because clearly this attack is feasible. Because in 2010, we learned about the assassination of Mahmoud al-Mabhouh. He was a Hamas officer, and allegedly he was murdered by Mossad in a hotel room in Dubai. And according to the Dubai police investigation, the way they were able to access the hotel room was that they used this exact piece of software called LockLink to reprogram the lock. Now, the downside in this attack is that, first of all, if you reprogram the lock, you can later see that, yes, the lock was reprogrammed. So it does leave a trace. Secondly, if your goal is to be able to enter multiple hotel rooms, you need to reprogram each and every lock. So we decided that we need a more elegant plan.
So we go then to the access tokens. So here the success criteria would be that we are able to clone an access token, which should be doable in most cases, or produce an access token that has more privileges. And by more privileges, I mean that if I'm in room 1 and I need to impersonate Timo, who's on room 2, I can create a card that will impersonate Timo's card. It's more handier that way when you're emptying the minibar. And then, of course, you could have a master token that gives you access to all the doors. So we needed a plan. First, we need to understand how Magstripe works. Then we get a Magstripe encoder, decoder. We get a few hotel cards, and so on. So there we go. Magstripe card is the one that you're typically used to seeing in your wallet. Many of the credit cards still have Magstripe card, and most of those cards have 3 different tracks. These are standardized. But unfortunately for research purposes, you don't really do anything with this information, because many of the locking systems use completely proprietary things. So that the syntax might be that there is a start sentinel, there is some data, there is an end sentinel, and something called LRC, which is basically a checksum. But for example, in WinCard's case, there is the hotel may choose to use track number 1 and 2 for different purposes, let's say minibars or loyalty programs or whatever. But the third track on the Magstripe holds the actual WinCard lock data. So in order to analyze that, you need to have a piece of software and a hardware to do that. We used this one, which is a German manufactured encoder, decoder, and this is a beautiful piece of hardware because it doesn't do any decoding or encoding on this hardware. It's software only, and it comes with this really good piece of software that enables you to do Magstripe analysis manually. So here you can see the modulation of the track. Here you can see on the upper right-hand corner, you can see the swipe speed. And here's some analysis of the data. You can also see that most probably this card has been used at least twice because of these patterns. If it would have been used only once, it would have only one of these kind of patterns. It's also very, very handy because some of the, at least in Scandinavia, many of the parking lots, they use these kind of magstripe cards, and what they do is that they use within a one track, they use 2 different types of modulation as a copy protection scheme, so that you're not able to clone the card usually with a regular hardware. With this hardware, you can do it easily. I didn't say that. Then we had to get few hotel cards, and by few, I say like few hundred, or a few thousand, or even more. Luckily, we have friends in low places that were able to supply us plenty of cards that enabled us to do the analysis. Then we decided that we'll just reverse engineer the track data on these cards and be done with it. This is how the card looks like. And while you can maybe use some data out of it, maybe they are using some sort of XOR pattern or something, but this did not really work. It might sound stupid, but this approach has been very, very solid for other types of hotel cards previously. To the point that when Major Malfunction gave his talk about magstripe madness and showed a bit stream there, pretty much everybody in Berlin knew that that was Alexanderplatz Park Inn that was on the track. So at this point, we didn't really care about the elegance anymore. We just needed a better plan. So, new plan was that we will acquire the Vision software, which is basically the software that is being used as a backend solution for provisioning these cards. And then we would reverse engineer the software, and then we would just go on from there. So, acquiring software, really easy because of internet. So you just do some Google magic, and then you can download the whole full installation CD and the accompanying manual, so the PDF that comes with it. So then you just reverse engineer the software and you'll be done with it, right? Oh, well, it turns out that it's not that easy. First, you need to read and understand product manuals. And when I say read and understand, I mean like 500 pages of those. And that became such a complicated task that we had to draw our own mind map in order to understand this. When we showed this to the S-Abloy guys, they told us that we actually have a better documentation of the system than they do. And if you zoom in, we actually documented each and every piece of thing. So, for example, here we have some use cases that map the actions. So if you click on a use case, it actually documents, it's documented here what happens there. And it goes on and on and on. So we have fields of interest here, like unique user identification. How does that work? Or how the randomness works. And, well, you get the idea. The best thing here was that once we went through all the manuals and documented everything, we realized that you can become a hacker by reading a manual. And the way it works is that we had one issue when we installed the software. We didn't really have a license for it. So for a while we figured that, okay, maybe we just need to go old school and crack it. But then Timo figured out a better way, which is just to read the manual, because this is from the manual, and it has an example, and Timo just entered those values to the actual program, and you can use the manual documented fields and enable your licensed copy of Vision Wing Card software. So that's how you become a hacker. That's how we got here. So the next plan was to build a hotel, and while we didn't have enough time for that, we just decided to build a lab, which looked something like this. And at this point, we figured out that, okay, we can't really use magstripe for this. And the issue we had was that while this piece of hardware is super fine for most of the things, it's super unreliable. So if you swipe the same card twice, you might end up having 2 different dumps of it. And if you're doing research, it's a bit painful thing when you don't know if the dump the values that you have are actually real or they're just some writing errors or encoding errors. And what we would have needed was this device. Unfortunately, it costs thousands of euros. And we couldn't really afford that. So we figured that, okay, forget this as well. And we're just going to build a lab with an RFID reader. It doesn't really matter because RFID is a kind of a new kid in the block anyways. So we decided to go for this. Initially, we went for this because of the documentation. So the documentation said that we should be able to get the lab environment working with this encoder-decoder. And immediately, 20 hours later, we were able to get it work. This story is so embarrassing that I'm only going to share it here with you and a few thousand people who will watch the video afterwards. So we didn't really realize, because our lab had been built with the magstripe in mind, so we didn't really realize that you need to actually rerun the installer before it installs all the blocks or all the building blocks needed for the RFID thing. So we spent like 20 hours debugging it, and why aren't these DLLs loading and why isn't it working? And then finally figured out that, oh, we need to rerun the setup.exe. And then we got it working, and we were able to provision our own cards on our lab environment. This is this beautiful Delphi-enabled piece of software that allows you to write your own key cards. Then we had to acquire a working knowledge of RFID. And the problem was that we had never done anything with RFID, and that kind of explains why this took 15 years from us. So it turns out that there is a lot to be learned about RFID, but in this case, they are using mostly ultralight or ultralight EV1 cards, and these are not crypto cards in themselves. So they are just, you could think of them as like a glorified USB stick, more or less. They are just storing data. The EV1 is a slightly better version of ultralight, meaning that it has a shared secret. But that has nothing to do with security. It's basically just a feature that is trying to stop cloning these cards. So it's a shared secret that gets broadcasted when you're accessing your log with this ultralight EV1 card. And if you have a fine piece of hardware like PROXMARK, you can just listen to that traffic and get the shared secret from that handshake.
Once we finally had the software running and we were able to create the key cards, it was easy to start reverse engineering the thing. One of the first things that we did was, since we had hundreds of those RFID cards, we dumped the data from those hotel key cards. And simply looking at the data on the cards, it was easy to notice this 33-byte sequence. And the reason why that sequence looked familiar was that those were very similar to the 33 bytes that you have on the magstripe cards. And this is exactly the same format that you have there. So you have 33 bytes, and the first one is a checksum byte, which also works as an encryption key. And when I say encryption, I mean a single byte XOR. So a very simple encryption. The challenge with the data is that the format sucks. So let's say you have a 1 byte logical value. It might be that you need to take 5 bits from here, and then you take 2 bits from here, and then the final bit from another offset. So the logical values are collected from small collection of bits. And in order to understand the structure of the data, to document it and also to visualize it with things like this, we used KaiTai-struct. This is a pretty nice tool. So what you do is you first describe the data, you describe the sequence of bits and bytes, you basically just label the bytes and bits, and after that you can combine those into logical values like you can see on the last line. So you have 5 bits and 2 bits and 1 bit, and you combine it into a single value. Once you've done this, you can generate the kind of graphs that I just showed you. And the other nice thing is that from that definition, you can create a deserializer for your favorite programming language. So you just automatically process the declaration of the data, and then you have a deserializer. In our case, we used Python. So this was a fairly nice tool to help with the documentation and visualization of the data. And once we more or less understood, or at least we thought we understood the structure of the data, we were able to start the quest for the master key. So the master key is something that opens all the doors in the hotel. The first thing that we tried was simply updating the facility code on the master key. Facility code is simply a number that uniquely identifies the hotel. So what we did was we created a master key in our lab environment. We updated the facility code to match a real hotel, and then we tried that key in that real hotel, and we failed. It didn't work. It would have been awesome if this would have worked, but no. At this point, we were actually still quite far from the solution. So we decided that, okay, let's take a step back. Let's try something more simple. Let's try cloning a normal guest key card to a real hotel. Again, we failed. And this should have been simple. I mean, there's no reason why this wouldn't work. So we had to do some more reverse engineering, and at some point we learned that if you look at the data on the key card, the last 4 bytes are a checksum generated by the vision software that the hotels use to create those key cards. And that checksum ties the data back to the unique identifier of that RFID card. So if we would have used those Chinese RFID cards where you can also control the UID, we wouldn't have had this problem. But since we didn't control the UID, the cloning failed because we didn't have the correct checksum at the end of the data. Once we had reverse engineered the software, we knew how to calculate the RFID checksum, and then we were finally able to create a physical tag that is a clone of a real hotel key. So at least some progress. The next logical step was to try to simulate a key. So instead of writing a physical tag that you can use, we wanted to simulate a key with the PROXMARK device that we were using. Here's the device. So that's the revision 3. And that's a very capable device. I mean, you can read RFID, write RFID tags, you can simulate them, you can do lots of things. Very powerful. For some reason, we didn't get the simulation working though. We failed. And this was probably one of the most challenging things to debug during the whole research.
This almost turned us into an alcoholics.
Luckily, just almost. So here you can see the state diagram of a MyFair ULTRALIGHT card. The state diagram isn't really anything that complicated, but before you can read any data from the card, or before you can write any data to the card, you need to reach this active state. And the way you get to the active state is through a process called anti-collision. And the reason they have the anti-collision process is that it might happen that you have a reader, and then within the field of the reader you have 2 different RFID tags. So there needs to be a process for the reader to select to which tag it wants to talk to. So basically it first asks that, okay, what tags do we have? Both of the tags say, yeah, I'm here. Then it says, okay, now it's your turn to talk, you shut up, and then the other way around. And that way the reader can talk to multiple different tags. It's really not that complicated. It's a fairly simple protocol. You can think of it like a simple handshake. And you can imagine our frustration that it was this simple handshake that was clearly failing. And we were using a very well-known device, PROXMARK, so we thought that, okay, this should work. Now that I know what was the problem, I can also easily see why it didn't work, because the protocol is a mess. We had to do a lot of reading. We went back to the ISO standards. We actually went back to the ISO standard that defines how the communication works on the radio level, how you're supposed to transmit and receive data. And this is a wonderful protocol. I mean, this is simply awesome. Depending on what command you're using and depending on what data you're sending, there's a different delay that the card has to wait before it replies back to the reader. So based on the command and the data sent by the reader, the tag has to wait for a different delay. And there's probably a very good reason behind all this. I don't really understand physics or signal processing or anything. There's probably a good reason why it was designed this way, but this was where the problem was. So the PROXMARK didn't simply use the correct delay. So once we identified the problem, it was very simple to patch. We created a patch, then we did a pull request to the Iceman fork. The patch was merged, and now it's publicly available for everyone. Because the truth is that without devices like PROXMARK, I mean, it's probably fair to say that we would have never finished this research. I mean, we don't have the skills to build devices like that. So we were very lucky to have that kind of devices available, and hopefully this was a small way of being able to give back to the community. Okay, now we're able to simulate keycards, some progress at least. So now we need to understand what are the relevant values within those 33 bytes. There's multiple logical values within that 33 bytes. Now, if you reverse engineer the software, and if you look at the database, and if you read all the manuals and patents and other documentation, you can find out that most of those values have names, like human readable, human understandable names. And you can imagine that some of those names sound much more exciting and interesting and promising than other names. So obviously when we were trying different values and trying to identify the interesting fields, we first focused on those fields that had a really promising sounding name. This is a totally made up name, but if the name of the field would be that, like master key enabled, yes or no, that sounds like a promising name if you want to create a master key. Didn't work. We were focused on the most promising sounding fields, but no luck. And this was a very disappointing part of the research. I mean, we were like, this should have already worked. So we had to sit down and figure out a different approach for creating the master key. And we came up with one. Thanks to our connections, we were able to get a working master key to a real hotel. So we were able to borrow a real master key to a hotel, and we cloned that one. And what we started doing was we started corrupting the fields, started corrupting the values on that card one by one. And if the card stopped working after we had corrupted a field, we knew that, okay, this field is relevant if you want to create a valid master key. And this was the process that finally led us to identifying the relevant values on the card. Fortunately, there's not that many important values. However, we had one value and one problem, and key space was one of them. The value had so many bits that if you simply wanted to figure out what's the correct value, the only approach you could take was to brute force it. It seemed that there was no logic behind it, so we just had to brute force it. And the natural way to do it for us was to create a custom PROXMARK firmware. So that's what we did. Simulating a card is easy with PROXMARK. There's already a function for that, so there was nothing really difficult there. We just gave it slightly different data every time, so what we were doing was modifying that one value. The more challenging part was that when you bring a key card to the lock, it tries to read it, and if you hold it there, it tries to read it again. So what we basically had to do was pull out the card, just like a human would do. If you show the card to the lock and it gives you a red light, you probably take the card back and then show it to the reader again. So this is something that we had to do in software. We had to find a way of somehow turning off the radio field, and the most straightforward way that we found was to simply turn off the field, and we did that by turning PROXMARK back to a reader. So instead of acting as an RFID tag, it acted as a reader, and that was enough to turn the field, and then the log thought that, okay, there's no more key present, and once we go back to simulating a card, the field is enabled again, and then the log is like, oh, there's a new card. And simply doing this in a loop, we were able to try multiple cards in a row. The speed wasn't really that great. We were able to try about 1 card per second. And what this means in practice is that, okay, if you have a 4-bit value, you can try all the different combinations in 16 seconds. Not bad. If you go up to 16 bits, it already takes 18 hours. And if you have more than 16 bits, I mean, it's game over. It's doable, theoretically, but not in practice. So even though we were able to brute force the values, it still wasn't good enough.
So going back to that, so at this point, many of you might be wondering, like, okay, why do you guys just didn't reverse engineer the thing to death and then went on with that? It's the reason, the answer is quite simple. It would not have helped. So all these installations are unique. So the values, many of the values get deployed at the install time. And we realized this once we got access to that master key of a real valid hotel. So that got us thinking like, okay, so how does this actually work? I mean, we are just two simple hillbillies, but I mean that there has to be thousands of guys worldwide who are installing these systems, and there has to be a process. And with our mad Googling skills, we were able to find out that there is a thing called Asabla University. And while we didn't break into that website, we figured out that there has to be a process how you deploy these cards, how you deploy these systems, how you install these. And because we had a bunch of cards from all around the world, and we had dumped all those cards, we were able to do analysis on those cards and then go back to the drawing board and figure out that, yes, there is actually a process vulnerability that we can use in order to reduce the key space. So instead of having gazillion bits to go through, we were able to narrow it down to a point where the brute forcing only takes about 10 to 20 seconds. And this is how it looks like. So, victim checks into a hotel, a thing that you have done multiple times, leaves her card on the table by accident, and for us, it takes about, with PROXMARK, it takes about half a second to clone a card, and then we can pick any lock in that hotel and try as long as needed to find the master key. And to prove that we actually were able to create the master key, if you push those elevator buttons without the proper key, they will just go back to the dim state. And if you enable or use our master key, you're able to go to any floor, which means that we actually were able to create a master key. And by doing this, we were able to do it without breaking a law. So, the title of the talk is something to do with ghosts, right? Ghosts in the locks. So, what does it mean? How do you become a ghost? So, you have the access tokens, you have the electronic lock. And if we're looking at this lock, this device, like I mentioned earlier, it's a standalone device. It collects some data when you're using it, but it's pretty dumb. It doesn't really communicate with anything else than the card. So this lock is actually programmed when you use your card. That card programs the lock every time. So what would it require to see this attack or do forensics on this? That, okay, to prove that it was these two hillbillies doing the attack. So, first of all, what we can do, that there are those three phases. There is the one where we clone the token or use our own card or expired key card. It doesn't matter. Any card from that facility will do. It doesn't have to work even anymore. And then we clone that card, and then we use PROXMARK to generate all those possible values, and then run the test cases against a lock. We can do that against a single lock. So let's say that we find a storage room. We just go there and brute force it against that, or the garage door, or we can distribute it across multiple locks. So you have one corridor full of locks. We can try, for each and every lock, we can try it only once. And what the lock does, it records an audit trail. If we look at the specification, the most advanced lock types have 600 events stored on that lock. And the values stored there are user ID code, issue area code, time of the event, and then few bits that are most often country-specific. So you can decide that this override function actually means that if you lock the door from inside physically, is the maid allowed to override that with the electronic key card, or to override the electronic lock with her key card? So those type of things. The problem here, that the only field that the attacker does not control is the timestamp. So we have multiple options here. We can either write there so much data that the buffer overflows and it's just filled with meaningless junk, or we can forge the data to contain any type of actions. We can frame the hotel owner or anybody that they have done actions on that door lock. Or even if we wouldn't do anything, what it would require is that, remember this beautiful small piece of device? In order to get access to that audit trail, you need to physically walk to each and every lock and collect the data from there and then do analysis on it. Based on everything that we have seen, it's not going to happen. So it's basically impossible to do any sort of reliable forensics to any of these logs when the only thing you have is probably a timestamp. So that's how you become a ghost. And at this point, the only thing left was like a boss. Some of you might recognize this fine gentleman, Charlie Miller and Chris Volosek. Oh, there's one more thing. So remember when I briefly mentioned that there is also this back-end component? So if you were to hire a professional pen testing company or a company that does any sort of application level assessments or host reviews or that kind of things, this is the thing that they would do first. And this is also what we did kind of first. So we had this idea that, okay, let's look at the scenarios where we would compromise a single device at the reception, or we would take a look at the back end, like if we can access it remotely. So the plan was that we will once again reverse engineer the software to death and then to see if we can pose even more. So this is how it looks like. It looks solid piece of engineering, right? On a Norwegian style. And the first thing that we did was that based on the manual, we were able to find out that these guys are actually using remote sharing. So standard Windows networking. Back in the day, I accidentally reversed the whole SMB CIF stack. So I know a thing or two about the Windows networking stuff, but it proved out to be useless in this case. So you couldn't really access this remotely. And we tried it, and yes, if you're in the same network, there is a chance that you might be able to access it, but it was kind of a dead end. But then we looked at the database, and it turns out that Vision is running Sybase Adaptive Server Anywhere, listens on that port, and the database passwords are derived from magic constants. So now, if you go back to what I said earlier, all these installations are custom. So they change from one installation to another. But these are the default credentials, so if you want to play with the demo database, this gives you DBA level access to that. So we tried those out against the demo database, and we got full system compromise. We were able to do whatever. The only requirement was that we need to be physically in the same network. And by physically, I mean as long as the Wi-Fi antenna carries us. So we dumped the whole database scheme and found some really, really interesting information there. For example, you have employee data there. So this hack allows us to, what was not mentioned earlier. Yes, we are able to emulate all the guests, but we are also able to emulate all the employee key cards. So we can emulate anybody or impersonate anybody. So it gives us access to the employee roster, but also to all the guest data that the hotel has. And we weaponized that, and this is how it looks like. We just get access. The only requirement is that we need to have an access to the same network, and then we can dump all the customers and their respective bit stream from their data. So we just copy-paste those values, put them into a card, or emulate them with PROXMARK, and we can again impersonate anybody in that hotel. Greetings to Dave Eitel. So, conclusions. If you're not smart, you have to be persistent. It took us 15 years of on and off research doing this. So some other people, they play soccer or do some other stupid stuff. For us, it's been this and few other projects. We don't claim that this is unique. Most of you would be able to do this just given a few months of active research. This was a fun project, and we learned a lot by doing this. One of the main takeaways was that doing physical access control systems securely is super difficult. You have to get the mechanics right. You have to get the signaling right. You have to understand something about software-defined radio or RFID communications in general. You have to be good at software engineering. You need to have a solid SDLC processes in place and so on. The list goes on and on and on. And it is super challenging to do it right. There is this old wisdom that the attacker only needs to succeed once and the defender has to succeed all the time. We don't really believe in that, but it is difficult to do this properly because effectively, it also requires a seamless cooperation between all the people who are part of the product development process. So it is a challenging thing to do properly. I would like to thank ASA Abloy. They treated us with respect when we reported this to them. They took this very, very seriously. The first meeting we had was with their CTO and their head of engineering, and we've been cooperating with them ever since. And most probably, if you go there, you will see more about what they've been doing about this. We are also happy to report that this hotel is patched. So well done, organizers. Thanks for letting the hotel management to know, most probably. And we would also like to give some shout outs to our good friends. We would not have been able to do this without help from our friends. We would really like to give a big hand to the whole hacking community, because lately it's been too much InfoSec drama and too little hacking. So we would like to get back to old school. So, thank you.
Any questions from the floor? We'll take questions off stage then. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Tomi and Timo. That was a very entertaining and very informative talk. Thank you. Good to know that we're all safe. Everyone who's staying in this hotel, we're all in good hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you.